This is, bless you. Thank you. Well, good evening. I wish that were somebody else to follow that introduction rather than myself. It would be terrible to prove all of that wrong within the next 45 minutes. But it's really an honor for me to be in India, an honor to be in the city of Kolkata, I guess. A lot of things changed since I was here over the years. The first time I was ever here, I was a teenager. I was 19 years old when I came here in 1965, and that was to speak at the church that Mark Buntain was pastoring. I was part of the first Indian teen team. I was here with Kenny Nyanakan and Sundar Krishnan, my sisters, and a few others. I think I preached one of the worst sermons in my life, but fortunately I was sitting next to Mark Buntain. He was such a kind man. He just said that was wonderful and welcomed me back. But it's nice to be here and to be in my beloved home country. I was telling my colleague Sanj, who travels with me, that the only problem is bahut khana khate hain yahan par. I consume a lot, and so much so kapde badalna hai na, because it gets bigger and bigger. And when we go back home, we can reveal the fact that we didn't just work, we also enjoyed some great cuisine of this great country. And of course, you have a unique touch here in Kolkata. We've enjoyed some of your great fish curry, and I'm sorry we're only here for a day. And tomorrow we will be on our way to Trivandrum, and then my colleague and I go on from there. I've got to speak in Bali, from Bali to Jakarta. I've already done 4 countries before coming here, so I'm looking forward to getting back home and being with my families. But you know, being in India, it's a land of engineers. We produce, I think, the highest rate of engineers in the world. Now, if only we can work on our roads with those engineers, we'll be okay. But we have the great engineers, so it was something like this that I remember reading that this joke has to come from India. This guy is being interviewed for a position, and he sits down in front of the interviewer, and the interviewer looks at him and says, if you're traveling in a train and it gets very hot in the compartment, what will you do? He said, well, I'll open the window. And the interviewer says, okay, if the window is 1 square meter in dimension, and the room is 12 cubic meters in dimension, and the train is moving at 60 kilometers an hour, and the wind is at 15 kilometers an hour, how long would it take to lower the temperature? The guy says, I don't know. He says, then you're going to fail, and let him go. So he walked out of there, and he had a classmate, and the classmate said, what is the interview like? He says, it's awful. He says, this is what he told me. I said I would open the window, and then he goes into this cubic meters and square meters and temperature and speed and all of that. So the second guy comes in, and the interviewer looks at him and says, if you're in a train that's getting really hot, what will you do? He said, I'll take my jacket off. The guy says, but what if it's still hot? He said, I'll take my shirt off. He said, but what if it's still hot? He said, I'll take my trousers off. And the guy says, what if you're going to die from the heat? He said, I'd rather die than open that window. Yeah, you engineers can figure it out. I couldn't do a thing to figure that out. And I'll also walk out of there and say, Pata nahi kya bol raha hai? I have no way to answer this question. But you know, we all ask questions. Right from the time we're young. Why? How? Who said it? Why should I believe it? We are constantly a questioning entity, trying to find out the answers to the deepest questions of life. And I want to begin by reading for you the words of a well-known Yale philosopher, Nicholas Walterstorff. I think it's a remarkable comment that he made when he years ago lost his son in a terrible accident, a hiking accident. His son was in his 20s, And Walter Storff has written a powerful book. He's a well-recognized philosopher of religion. And he wrote a powerful book called Lament for a Son. And it's not the kind of book that leaves you excited, but it's a kind of book that leaves you with the most profound questions in life itself. But here's what he said. When we have overcome absence with phone calls, winglessness with airplanes, summer heat with air conditioning, when we have overcome all of these and much more besides, then there will abide two things with which we must cope: the evil in our hearts and death. When we've overcome all these things, winglessness with airplanes, and the capacity to communicate across distances, all these inventions, many of them from some of the most brilliant minds in this country. Certainly India's greatest export is knowledge, the bright intellectual strength and depth that this country has as a gift from God. How wonderful it would be if we had all of our deepest questions of the soul to be answered as well. It was, I think, Longfellow who said, life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. So the old adage of YOLO, you only live once. What if you add just one phrase to that? You only live once eternally. What if I added that one word? You know, the ancient Greek philosophers, Parmenides said, whatever is, is. And Heraclitus came around and said, whatever is changing. Added just one word, from permanence to constant flux. And he said, you never step into the same river twice. Cratylus came along and said, actually, you don't even step into the same river once. What did he mean by that? Just as the water is flowing, your body is also changing constantly. So the you that steps in is in constant flux in the river that is in constant flux. And so you never really step into the same river even once. Whatever is. Whatever is changing. But you don't even step into the same river once. The fact of the matter is that life presents these huge philosophical conundrums. And one of the greatest longings we have as individuals is the ability to have choices, to choose. If you talk to a man who was a one-time alcoholic and then changes and finds his heart has been corrected, and while he was in the throes and the depths of alcoholism, spending all of his money on that which was taking his brains away, and then he finds redemption and changes, and all of a sudden he finds he has choices for his expenditure. Once upon a time, not even being able to boast of one suit, now having found that redemption, he wonders which suit I should wear, that gift of choice. But that gift of freedom is itself not free. It's a huge cost that you and I pay for freedom. Why was freedom necessary? Why was freedom so important? The reason is that the greatest ethic in this world is love. Love is the supreme ethic. And where love is possible, freedom is necessary. But where love is also entered into, pain also has the possibility of entering into your life and mine. This triangular notion of freedom, love, and pain, they are inextricably bound together, and that which God had joined together, let no one put asunder. These are realities that we must understand. But you know, you and I are not the first ones who talk about freedom, or you only live once. There was a great thinker by the name of Solomon who did the same question that we have in our time and raised the same question. And the question was, why not eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. You only live once. That was the philosophy he was entertaining. This is how he stated it. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaninglessness. You see, you and I think that the greatest problem we have is the problem of pain. I'm not sure that's true. I think the greatest problem we really have is the problem of pleasure. And the most difficult word in the English language or in Hindi is no, nahi, no. I cannot cross this boundary. I cannot cross this line. And so he said, I said to my heart, let's find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish and all, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. And he ends up by saying, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. There are two phrases you need to understand. One is under the sun. Under the sun is a Hebraism that means locked in this time temporary structure with no God, nothing coming in. We're in a closed system. Under the sun, there's no transcending narrative. We are locked into time and space. And he said, I found out everything was a chasing after the wind, and everything was meaningless. And America is dealing with an incredible story right now, with this man who was close to being a billionaire, but exploited young women and went into an indulgent life and ends up in a prison cell having hanged himself. I wonder what his last thoughts were. I was born in a country with so much. I had so much, and now I am in a prison wanting some way to strangle myself and get out of the mess that I made of my life. You see, meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. We could have all the best structures in the world, the best buildings, the best roads, the best transportation, the best everything. But the problem ultimately is not the best out there. The problem is, how do I find the best in here for why I was actually created? And Solomon says he had all that he wanted, a harem. He loved horticulture, he loved proverbs, he loved literature, he loved philosophy. In fact, he nearly drove the nation bankrupt with his expenditures. But he said, I found out it was all a chasing after the wind. Brought nothing. What is the answer to that? What is the answer to true freedom? I believe the answer is in the story that we have of Jesus's temptation to have unlimited freedom. The story of Jesus' temptation to have unlimited freedom. So it says Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. So this is not a life of luxury for him right now. He's in the desert. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered and said, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." What is he saying? Unlimited freedom. Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him and the angels came and ministered to him. Here's what I want to say to you. In every temptation to abandon any restraints, Jesus responded with the word of God. "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples. Then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." If you abide in my word, you're my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So knowing the truth is inextricably bound to true freedom. Because if you're living a lie and absolutely free, you have an infinite variety of ways in which you can stumble and self-destruct. So the first thing is the temptation. Why don't you turn these stones into bread? And Jesus says, basically, you've got the wrong story. You've got the wrong story. This is not the story of what humanity was all about. I was thinking today as I was preparing to deliver this talk, how important it is to get the story right. If you ask two people who saw an accident, you may get two different versions, and then you say, yeah, they're different perspectives. But now, after being in the ministry for nearly 50 years, I realize sometimes how many stories I did not get right. So you call somebody else and say, "Do I have the story right now?" And they correct you, and you go back to it. So you get different perspectives, and then you find your own memory falters, and you have to get the story right. Malcolm Muggeridge, till the day he died, said he never preached in a particular place, but there is a record of him having come there and spoken at that particular place. The years just failed him in that memory. Sometimes you get a wrong date, sometimes you get a wrong venue. I've done that, and you pay the price for it when somebody really wants to go after you. But I'm telling you, it is actually possible, where you get something mixed up in a story and you falter. So two people from their perspectives can get a story wrong. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 says, I baptized just two people there. And then he says, come to think of it, also the house of Stephanus. And then I cannot remember who else I actually baptized there. So perspectives vary, faults of memories, but the most important flaw in is a story. Listen to me very carefully. The most important flaw in a story is if you do not know your own story. That's not a perspective. That's not a failing memory. That's a flawed premise. That's a flawed backdrop to what it is that life is really all about. And so I'm asking you, when the tempter comes to Jesus and says to him, turn these stones into bread and the world will follow you, Jesus basically saying to him, you don't understand this story. The problem of man is not the shortage of food. You can feed a lot of food, you can be surrounded by a lot of luxury, and you can be totally lost. I've lived in the Western world now for nearly 50 years of my life. I left Delhi when I was 20 years old. The America that I now see is an America that's totally lost, thoroughly confused. We do not know out there the definitions of anything anymore. It's heartbreaking to see what your children are taught in schools now, and having to correct fundamental issues about life and living. Why is that? Chesterton said, there's only one angle at which you can stand straight and many, many angles at which you can fall. So we abandon God and we fall in multiple different directions. I have a friend in India. He always comes out with some strange thoughts. He took a picture of a guy he lives in the States now. He's a wonderful high-tech guy. And he took a picture of a guy in Delhi or somewhere, Bombay, I forget what, sleeping under his tonga. Okay? Sound asleep around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, probably searing heat, sound asleep. And this guy sends me the picture and says, there are many people in America who'd pay a doctor thousands of dollars in order to get a sleep like that. What an amazing illustration that the heart is so restless even when the stomach is so full. It's a reality that Jesus tried to convey to you and me, that the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. That you and I are desperately lost, and how spiritually we are lacking and we are wanting. There's one word that none of us likes, but it's the most real aspect of your life and mine. We are all sinners before God. The world likes to talk of evolution. The Bible talks of devolution. You go backwards, professing ourselves to be wise, we become fools and worship the creature rather than the Creator. You know, it was Oscar Wilde who wrote a book called The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's a powerful book. A lot of people think it may well have been an autobiographical story. It's the story of a beautiful young man who looks so attractive that an artist looks at Dorian and he says, yours is the most beautiful face I've ever seen. And Dorian looks at the mirror and he says, wow, it's true. This is a beautiful face, perfect features. So Dorian's artist says, I'd like to paint a picture of you. Will you be my subject? So the artist paints it. And Dorian looks at it and makes a wish. He says, I wish no matter how I lived, I will always look as beautiful as this. Imagine that coming from the creative genius of Oscar Wilde. A brilliant writer and poet as well. And so Dorian goes around living the way he wants, and he says, you know, if I can only live any way I want, and I never have it show on my body, let it just affect this painting and mar the painting. But I don't want anything to mar me. So he takes the painting, puts it in the attic, and covers it with a cloth. And he lives any way he wants, doing all kinds of horrible things. The years go by, and the artist comes and says, Dorian, where's the painting? How are you doing? He said, oh, I'm doing fine. He said, I'd love to see the painting. And uncovers the painting. And the face is disfigured. It looks horrible, distorted. And the artist looks at Dorian and says, Dorian, what's going on? Remember, the Bible says, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they be red as crimson, they shall be white as wool. That's from Oscar Wilde. And Dorian realizes he is found out. He stabs the artist to death, puts him in a bag, and he takes him out to bury him. And when he comes back, he goes up to the attic again, and now he sees blood coming out this side of the mouth of the painting. He takes a knife and stabs the painting, and there's a blood-curdling scream. And the servants come running upstairs, and they see what's happened. The painting has returned to its pristine form of the way the artist had painted it, and Dorian's entire countenance gnarled and disfigured and damaged. If only I could live any way I want and it not affect me. I would live with absolute, unrestrained freedom. You see, freedom is not the privilege to do whatever you want. It's the strength to do what you ought to do. It's not the freedom or the liberty to do whatever you want. It's the strength to do what you should. And if you don't know your story, if you don't understand that your heart is desperately wicked, and ultimately you don't just need another teacher or some wisdom or some instructor, what you really need is a Savior. The Savior who will take your cause and change your heart. When Jesus enters your life, he doesn't only change what you do, he changes what you want to do. That's the key to the dramatic transformation that he brings. So the tempter, knows Jesus has this power, but he's lost this battle of the intellect. So he moves to the question of the will. And he says to Jesus, why don't you jump? Take the liberty. You are told that even if you were to jump, the angels will attend to you. Why don't you do that and see if your Father's promise to you is true? And Jesus responds to the text with a context. Any text without a context becomes a pretext. Any text without a context becomes a pretext and an excuse to do whatever it is you want. Jesus takes that precious truth, puts it into the context, and he says, you shall not test the Lord your God. What it really means is, don't become the God of God. See, the whole temptation in the Garden of Eden, the whole temptation of Eden was with one restriction, just one law. What is that law? Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if they do it, you're going to die. What that really means is, don't redefine morality. That's God's prerogative. So we've redefined it, and now what happens? We need so many cautions and so many laws. The healthcare law in America now has 2,000 pages. Why? Because we lie about it. That's why. That's why. And we know that in India very well. Mej ke niche. Haath garam karna. Warm the hand. I remember talking to a fellow Indian who said, our capacity is so great, but our corruption ends up becoming greater. And unless we can train the heart, the corruption will outrun the capacity. And that's where the danger really begins to come for a nation as great as this. I was talking to some very successful businessmen in Singapore last week, and one guy was really quite hostile. And I talked to him about the basic idea that we were discussing. And one of the things he took offense with is that the heart is deceitful and broken and so on. But then I knew he was a banker. He dealt with money. So I said to him, what is at the base of banking? And he wouldn't answer my question. Somebody else at the table said, trust. Did you get that? It was the answer I was looking for. At the heart of banking is not money. At the heart of banking is trust. That we trust each other with what we are agreeing to. And finally, I got him to admit that we couldn't even trust each other. And so you get onto a plane, and what do they tell you? There's a smoke detector. Do not touch, tamper, disable, or destroy. Why all those words? Just say, we've got a smoke detector here, don't mess with it. But the reason don't mess with it won't do in a court of law. So you need to do touch, tamper, disable, destroy, because somebody can say, well, I tampered with it, but I didn't destroy it. So you need all these words that die the death of 1,000 qualifications. And who are the most brilliant at manipulating words? Those in the world of law. Lawyers will tell you, I had a lawyer phone me and say, I have to apologize to you for my profession. Because all the shenanigans that we do, all the things that we do. But that's what happens when you become a master of any discipline. You can learn how to manipulate it. Muggeridge said, when I stand before God, I'm going to ask him to forgive me for being fatally fluent. For being fatally fluent, he knew how to use words. So Jesus resisted this temptation. Why do you think this temptation was so important? Let me tell you why. Had he given in, there would never have been a cross. If Jesus had given in, because the tempter came back at Calvary and said, if thou be thyself, save thyself and us, there would have been no cross in the gospel story. And if the story is true that your heart and my heart are desperately wicked, then the answer that Jesus provides is also the most unique and the most beautiful answer. You know, I love to come back to India 3 or 4 times a year, and the older I get, each time I leave with a little bit of heaviness in my heart. And I say, will this be the last time I'll see my home again? Hum dharti ke aadmi hain. You're a person of the soil. And so I go and visit my home in Delhi. Next year, in a few weeks, I'm coming back to do some filming right in my home where we once lived. I know the person now who lives there. We left in the mid-60s. And as I come back, the beautiful song we heard, hard to translate, you know. The way it is said in the depth of prose and phrases, very hard to give the best translation. The man had a beautiful voice. In fact, I was half tempted to say, I wish you'd sung at the World Cup this year too. Maybe there would have been a different result. But a beautiful story, the story of grace, forgiveness, and thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Some years ago when I came to Mumbai, I was staying at one of the hotels that had been attacked by the terrorists. It was just shortly after that. And I remember turning on the news and listening to a television personality interviewing one of the men who was right there at that restaurant. And in that restaurant is where the carnage took place. He was an Indian-born English actor. And he was being interviewed, and he said this. He said, you know, I was sitting with my friends and having dinner, and all of a sudden you hear the sound of gunfire, and it's so close. He said, we turned and saw these blazing guns, and we all dove for cover under the table. We're all bodies piled up in the Taj Mahal Hotel there in Mumbai, under the table. He said, I knew all of my friends had been shot, and they were dead. But I was on top of this pile, and I heard footsteps of the main killer coming closer and closer and closer. And I could sense that he was literally breathing down this pile of bodies, and he looked at us. I stopped breathing for a few moments so that he would just go by. And he did. And the interviewer said to him, why do you think he didn't kill you as well? All your friends you said were killed. Why do you think he didn't kill you? He said, I don't know the answer to that except one. He said, I was so covered with the blood of my friends that he probably thought I was already dead. I was so covered with the blood of my friends that he probably thought I was already dead. Ladies and gentlemen, what an incredible illustration of the blood of Christ. So covered by his blood that we are pronounced forgiven. You never earn it. You can never earn the gift of forgiveness. Gifts are given as the free will of the giver. And so I say to you, the cross is an essential part of the story, or your story would end in death and destruction. When I was 17 years old, I came to know Christ in Delhi on a bed of suicide. Many of you here are far smarter than I am. I would never have made it to the IITs in India. I would never have made it to the institutes of higher learning because I was undisciplined, just didn't study. I remember when I was speaking at the 100th anniversary of CMC Vellore, I made the comment that my dad wanted me to become a doctor, but I don't think I would ever have made it in their tests or their interviews. And the principal put his arm around me as we walked away and he said, "No, because God had something higher for you in mind than just to be a doctor of the body. God had in mind for you to be a doctor of the soul." Those were some of the kindest words ever spoken to a young man who didn't have the intellectual ability that many of you do. And I'm not just saying that, I believe it. But here's the point. The point I want to make to you is I lay in bed because I was living with total freedom. Total freedom. And it took me into a bed of suicide. And then a Bible was brought to me, and the words of Jesus in John 14:19, "Because I live, you also shall live." So the story is the problem of the heart. The solution is the provision of our Savior. And finally, the devil gave up. He went to the intellect, he went to the will, now he went to the imagination, which is probably the deadliest entry point for all of us, because it bypasses the front door of reason and comes to the back door of the imagination. That's why our children's lives are so important. Their imagination is fertile, and if you destroy that imagination, you destroy the person. And so he said, "I'll give you all the kingdoms of this world if you will just bow down and worship me." Here's the key to what real freedom is. Freedom is to find the purpose for which you were created. And Augustine said, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Augustine was an intellect, but Augustine was also a sensually driven man. He had tasted everything in sensual living. And he said, "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." You know, there's a friend we have who lives in Australia, is a handsome-looking guy. He served and made his living, a lot of it, living as a prostitute in Hollywood. He said, "Man customer, woman customer did not bother me. I would go anyway." He said, "For years, I never woke up in the same bed in which I had gone to bed the night before." Imagine that. And when he finally came to Christ, he now shares his testimony. He said, "That which was my means of making my living made me a most wretched human being till I hated actually myself." The story has to be gotten right, and the solution has to be embraced, and then you find the purpose. What is that purpose? What is that purpose? That purpose is not just for wealth, it's not just for our culture, it's not just for happiness, it's not just for all these wonderful things that we pursue. You see, the Hebrews said God is like the light, prosperity is like the shadow. If you walk towards the light, the shadow will follow you. If you turn your back upon the light and chase the shadow, you will never catch up to it. The life that God offers is in following the light that He has given. Why do we have so much of evil in the world today? You know, yesterday I got onto a plane from Delhi, and I bought the Telegraph, and under the page, The Nation. What did I see? The arrest of a former minister, the death of 3 IAF pilots, the murder of a one-month-old or 1-year-old child, I forget, by his uncle. All these stories, and I said to myself, boy, this reads like America too. You take the leading nations of the world, and what do you see? Every story is of brokenness, corruption, and we have no answer. Politics does not have the answer, because politics contains politicians, and politicians are humans like you and me. Politicians will never be perfect. Theologians will never be perfect. But we've got to get the story right. The story is that we're wrong. And God alone has the right answer. The depravity of man, said Malcolm Muggeridge, is at once the most empirically verifiable fact, even at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted. Did you hear that? The depravity of man is the most empirically verifiable fact, even at the same time that is the most intellectually resisted. So I'm going to give you one or two brief illustrations, and then I'm going to close. You know, we always have this big tension between faith and science. I believe in science, so I can't have faith. What? What? Do you think scientists don't have faith? They have faith in all of their findings. Let me give you a simple illustration. I was speaking in Burlington, Ontario, Canada, and a guy stood up and said, I'm a scientist, I live by the sciences. Science is supreme, the queen of the disciplines and all of that. So I let him talk. And then I said, which science tells you that you should be truthful in your findings? What exact science gives you that imperative? That you should be honest in your findings. I said, that's not physics, that's metaphysics. That's not science, that's philosophy. He just stared and stared at me and sat down. When Stephen Hawking wrote his book, and his last book before he died, and began one of the chapters by saying philosophy is dead, the chairman of the philosophy department at Cambridge really went after him. He said, the oracular Professor Hawking, I have to say this to you, sir, you have not kept up with our discipline as much as we have kept up with yours. Those who wheeled him around, those who took care of him, those who healed his hurts and bandages and healing and all that they did, that was not an imperative of science. That was an imperative of an ethical caring and an ethical desire to take care of our fellow human being. Years ago, I was in Delhi. I love Delhi. It's where I spent the major years of my youth. I always go downtown in Connaught Place, and I look at the coffee shop where I couldn't afford to buy the coffee those days. I always found a friend who could, and I'd take him with me, and we'd have some coffee there. So I was standing and walking, looking at this coffee shop above the Regal Cinema. And I saw a guy wheeling himself, one leg gone, all bandages, pretty bad, meager-looking creature to the eyes of well-heeled people. And I said, what must it be like to be in the body of this man? So I followed him. I didn't want to give him any money there. I waited till it was less populated area. And I said, Bhai Sahab, Bhai Sahab. And he stopped. His hands were like this, gnarled. And I had a 100-rupee note and put it into his hand. And he looked at me and he said, Sahab ji, Bhagwan aapko bhala kare. Bhagwan aapko bhala kare. May God richly bless you. I have never received a greater benediction than a benediction from the mouth of a broken body, because his soul still trusted in a supreme being. Bhagwan aapko bhala kare. And that's my prayer for everybody here. And so I say this, As I close, it is an important thing to bear in mind what temptation is all about and what the story is all about. May I read for you the words of one of the famous writers, Arthur Leonard Griffith, and he tells us in these words what the temptation is all about. Listen to me and I close. Satan tempts us at the point of our physical needs. Not that we might gratify them to excess, but that we might think of nothing else and gratify them at the expense of our usefulness in this world. Satan tempts us at the point of our ambitions, not that we might engage in positive evil, but simply accept the fact of evil, learn to live with it, come to terms with it, and maintain a discreet silence in the presence of it. Satan tempts us at the point of our religion, not that we might disbelieve in God, but that we might demand certainty of God and leave nothing to faith, nothing to God Himself. These are the moral struggles that have reality for people such as we are. The subtle temptation to renounce our duty in favor of what is attractive, the insidious allurement to a kind of half-goodness, which is the essence of everything bad, and which is more productive of suffering and hatred and war and misery in the world than all the designs of wicked and greedy people combined. Ladies and gentlemen, temptation is very subtle, and the greatest temptation is to have unrestrained freedom. There is no such thing as absolute autonomy, because if two absolutely autonomous people meet, one will have his autonomy threatened by the other. And that's why God's law is so supreme for you and for me. And David says that he learned to love that law. It is made for your benefit and mine. Chesterton said, whenever you remove any fence, always pause long enough to ask why it was put there in the first place. First, we've got to get our story. Second, we've got to get God's story. And then we find out that the story is ultimately to worship Him in spirit and in truth. The brokenness is not out there, it is in here. And in worshiping the living God, we bring unity in diversity. And that unity within is what we really desperately need. That comes in worship. May God richly bless you. And I thank you for being so patient and giving me a hearing. It's been my honor to present this talk to you. God be with you.